So thank you so much for joining us for our May resource group for Start a Brewery. Super excited to have Kary Shumway joining us today. I always start these out with a little bit of housekeeping and talk about our events that we have coming up. We're just on the heels of a successful CBC for Start a Brewery. That was our first lounge that we've ever hosted, and I'm super excited that everybody here right now was there for the lounge and talking to startups and people that would otherwise come up to the table and say, my brewery is making me crazy. How do I fix it? So really so much appreciation to everybody who joined us, whether part of Start a Brewery or whether you were at CBC and came up to visit with us. So our format for today, we're going to take a couple of minutes to talk about our sponsor and appreciate Arrived. We're going to, there's Julie, let her in. We're going to talk about our mission statement and then talk a little bit about what's coming up for Start a Brewery. Our mission statement, briefly, I always want to bring us back to the roots, is to raise the bar for startups through education while lowering the barrier to entry for those who want to live their dream and providing those resources to give them a leg up. We have a whole bunch going on. I wanted to mention too, we just added a section on the educational resources page on the website. It's called Free Business Coaching. And we have 4 different entities that do that. And I thought that would be really helpful for anybody, whether you're open or just starting up, to be able to find that section. Last week, we had our second quarter of 2023 webinar, and that was Charlie Gottenkinney from Brews Beers. And he talked about developing a sales territory plan. So if you haven't seen that, hop over to YouTube and take a look, because that is recorded, and I'll have it up on our YouTube channel, but right now it's up at Craft Beer Professionals. Yesterday, we released podcast episode 11, and that's called What Are You Brewing? It was a really interesting deep dive, kind of like we opened the door and all of our guests took the dive down the rabbit hole. Eric Fowler from White Labs, Neil Whitty from Cicerone Certification Program, Tapstar and Quality Craft Solutions, Nico Tonks from YCH, and Candace and I. It was a really interesting podcast, so I hope you'll all get a chance to listen. Next month's resource group, June 17th, you can mark that on your calendars. That's going to be Andy Mancine. He's from Brand Elixir Partnership, and he's going to take us into a little bit of distribution. So that'll be a fun twist. The next quarterly webinar is going to be August 16th, and Jeff O'Brien from Chestnut Cambronne is going to talk about how to raise investment capital for your brewery legally. That's his twist, is that he's going to talk about doing it legally. And then right after that at HomebrewCon in San Diego, we have a presentation we're going to do about foundation essentials, which was pulled from our podcast episode 3. Dustin was on that one. Candace, Dustin Hauk, Brooke Bristow, Will Camacho. We're going to do a presentation at HomebrewCon and then be in the expo there, just like we were at CBC. So very briefly, I wanted to take a few minutes to thank Arrived. They have been amazing champions of what we're doing and are sponsoring today's resource group. The formal description of the Arrived universe is that Arrived was founded by a couple of tech geeks who loved craft beer and the people who serve it. Or are we beer geeks who serve tech, they say. The more time spent talking shop and tap rooms, the more evident the need for a tap room POS system became. The first 6 months found us with our laptops at the bar, coding our system with real-time feedback from servers and managers, and they launched in 2017. So now they've expanded to food, drink, music, hospitality partners. That's breweries, cideries, pizzerias, meaderies, distilleries, kombucheries, music venues, food halls, axe throwing spots, food trucks, and more. And I think personally, on my own world, I really became more aware of Arrived when the pandemic hit and we needed contactless ordering. And that was they were the only people I knew that could do that. So I have been talking to and working with them a lot. And Nancy Trigg, who's formerly with Arrived, is one of our contributors. So appreciating Arrived today. I'm sorry nobody could be here to speak on their behalf from Arrived, but we can all certainly offer testimony in their universe. Kary, did you say you wanted to take questions as we go?
Absolutely.
Okay, super cool. So we're going to jump into our contributor spotlight portion of the universe to get to know Kary a little bit. So let's start out with a little bit about yourself. I kind of skipped all the different businesses because I wanted you to kind of tell the story about how you got involved with them and all of what you do.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Kary Shumway. I'm a CPA, CFO. So I worked for a beer wholesaler, and I work for a brewery as partner and CFO. And the businesses that I've sort of created are really financial education for the beer industry. So it kind of started as beer wholesalers because that's kind of what I was doing back in the day, and then shifted to kind of serve both beer wholesalers and breweries. So it's really just financial education and training. And I sort of deliver that in a couple of different ways, either one-on-one work with folks or, online courses that have sort of created this bank of, different courses that are accessible 24/7 to people that want to check them out. So it's craftbreweryfinancialtraining.com. We were out in Nashville at CBC, and people were like, "What the heck's the name of your company?" And I told them what it was. I'm like, "Oh, well, that explains what it is, but it's probably, it's kind of a mouthful." So I have two different things, beer business finance, also kind of evident as to what it is. It's financial training for those in the beer business. So that's a little bit about what I do. So I really will work with folks one-on-one if they need help, or I would direct them to this sort of DIY option where it's online, on demand. It's a subscription-based model where people can go in. There's tons of free resources as well. So you can go to craftbreweryfinancialtraining.com or beerbusinessfinance.com and kind of get the information there.
You also do stuff at the University of Vermont, yes?
Yep, do some teaching for them over the years. Different topics. I mean, mainly around distribution, self-distribution, wholesale, some taproom finances as well. So yeah, it's an interesting way to kind of connect with people that are, folks are coming into those programs, sort of in different places. Some are looking to start a brewery, others are working in the beer space in some capacity or another. Maybe they want to start their own thing someday. Others are just really trying to educate themselves on how, the industry works as a whole. So I found that really rewarding and a great partnership. And I know, Laura, you were kind enough to join me last year and bring your expertise to that as well. So it's always nice to kind of partner with somebody else because we all have our own perspective. It's like, I know what I've done and, I know what I screwed up or figured out and I can share that. But it's also nice to kind of have someone else's voice in the process too.
That was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that as well. So what do you do when you're not doing beer stuff?
That's all I do is beer stuff. I don't do anything else. I love, it's funny, like I love to be a very big sports guy. I love sports of all kinds, every kind. We're, I'm in the Boston area, so we have the Boston Celtics who are hanging on by their fingernails right now. I've had 20 years of, Patriots greatness in football. Hockey, we kind of flamed out here with the Bruins, best record in NHL history, and then they lost in the first round, which was rather upsetting. So I do watch a lot of sports. I play a lot of sports, love tennis, softball. We get a big group. One of my favorite things to do in the summer around here is do Friday night. We call it Friday night old person softball. So everybody comes out, you injure yourself, you hobble over and you just drink beer and cook out on the grill, and it's great fun. And as of late, one of my proudest accomplishments over COVID and the lockdown was becoming really good at cornhole. So I love the game of cornhole, and wasn't very good prior to, but you lock down, and the only sport that continued on through the pandemic in a live fashion was cornhole. So I'd go on ESPN. I'm like, cornhole? Who would ever watch this? Me. Watched it, studied, literally like, I'd have a beer and I'd practice, and it worked. And so now that's one of the things. Love playing a lot of tennis, softball, cornhole, getting out there and mingling with the people. And it's usually revolving around beer. My formula for success to get people together is you cook things like on a grill, and then you have beer, and people just show up.
So I understand that tennis evolves to pickleball if you do the old guys thing.
Yeah, I haven't gotten there yet. I've heard, people are, have you played pickleball? I haven't tried it. I've seen it, and I'm like, well, maybe someday, but I'm still able to kind of move it around a little bit. So tennis for me for now.
There you go. That's fair. All right. So specifically, what do you do with or for clients and what problems do you solve? You already touched on that some. Generally speaking, if you have somebody who's already open and looking to kind of retool things, is that kind of one primary area and the other would be maybe startups? What do you usually see?
Yeah, there's different buckets. I mean, people come at different, you kind of meet folks at different stages. So it probably does break out roughly into thirds, people that are looking to start a brewery, people that are kind of expanding, and then others that, boy, we're kind of struggling. We need to sort of figure this thing out. So for the startups, it's really like, how do most folks will come to me and say, we're putting together a business plan. We're trying to raise money. We're going to be working with a banker. We just need help with the financial portion of our plan. Most folks can kind of muddle their way through a business plan in terms of what's your mission, your vision, your objectives, your core values, and what's your marketing and so forth on a basic level. But the finances, they kind of get stuck and like, I don't really even know how this should even add up. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. So that's one way, is we'll kind of jump into that, and we'll kind of go through the basics of what that might look like, and kind of walking them through, because every problem seems like, gosh, I don't even know. You just break it down to its component parts, and there's models and formulas and steps that you go through. So in that instance, we'll do it generally one of two ways. I can work with them one-on-one, and we kind of break it down and generally into 4 sessions. So we'll meet for an hour at each time, and we'll kind of take one component of the financial plan, and we'll go through it together, and then I'll have my models, and we'll start filling out the models. Where we start with, how are you going to capitalize this thing, right? What are you going to buy, and where are you going to get the money to pay for it? And then we kind of work that into the economics of the plan. Like, okay, you're going to borrow that money. How are you going to pay it back? And let's make sure that the thing cash flows properly. So then we start talking about, how do you get to cash flow? We'll go through the sales plan, cost of goods, margins, operating expenses, touch on some other cash flow items in that way, so that by the end of four sessions, 4 weeks roughly, we've got a good plan that's ready to rock and roll. And one of the things that I've enjoyed doing, that I think people seem to like, or maybe they're making fun of me when they tell me they like it, I don't know, is I make these little videos. So we'll do a little Zoom. We'll talk about a lot of, some can be kind of dense and complicated and whatnot. And I'll just sort of give a 5 to 10 minute, all right, here's what we talked about. And I'll do like a video overview. This was, say, the sales forecast. Here's how we kind of came up with these numbers. Here are the underlying assumptions, so that they can go back. So rather than having like an hour video to go back to and be like, man, where was that part when he talked? It's just like a really condensed, kind of 5-minute recap, sort of with me talking over it and showing them on the models, what we did. So that type of approach is applicable for startup breweries, but also for those, there's so many breweries, so many businesses, frankly, that don't have a financial plan, a budget. For a lot of reasons, generally nobody likes to make a budget, so they don't. And, it's like, wow, we kind of need a budget. So once you have that budget in place, now it's like, great, you got to use it, implement it, track against it, do your variance analysis. So I'll work with people kind of on an ongoing limited basis, where you can sort of check back and say, all right, we thought sales were going to be X. Where are they coming in? What gaps do we need to close? What things are popping up? And that could be any number of things. Cost of goods sold is out of whack. Something's going crazy here. Maybe we need to analyze sort of the financial reports themselves. Are they getting what they want out of them? So a lot of that one-on-one stuff. And I try to take, because a lot of this is sort of, it's systematic, right? So once you do it with one client, another and another, it's like we're pretty much doing kind of the same process. So I took that and just turned it into a course. So it's like, we can work together, and you can ask me questions and I'll answer them, which can be very helpful for folks. Or you can take the course and kind of, it's me sort of saying the same things. It's not quite as interactive. We do a lot of shoot me a comment, shoot me an email. So that can be helpful for folks that are maybe a little more budget conscious and or like a DIY approach, because we in the craft brewery, we like to do things ourselves. I think that's awesome. So that gives them that opportunity. And I didn't mention we've recently started a Beer Business Finance Association. So it's a network of brewery owners and operators that are focused on the finances of their business. They really don't have anybody to talk to. So come together. We do sort of a virtual. We talk about best practices and information sharing. How are you compensating your sales force, for example? What are you tracking for KPIs? On and on and on. So anything that's really touching the financials of the brewery, this is a great opportunity for a lot of peer-to-peer networking, interaction, new connections to be made. We do CBC, Craft Brewers Conference once a year, and we do have our state guild meetings and whatnot, but these are fairly infrequent. So the idea here would be to make this regular and consistent and focused on the financial aspects of a brewery. So that was kind of a mouthful there, but that's sort of an overview of how I might work with clients or how they can interact with the materials that I have.
Mm-hmm. A lot of different ways. Do you have combinations like they'll first take the courses and then they'll sign up for some time with you?
It's usually how it works, because folks are like, yeah, I can do this, and they get in there, and some certainly can, and others are like, I could figure this out, but man, it would be a lot easier if you just kind of told me where to look. And a lot of times people want me to look at their stuff. So what I'm presenting is I try to be very practical with it, because I recognize that most of the population, even in the business world, they're non-financial folks, right? They didn't get into brewing to, be an accountant, for goodness sakes. It's about the beer, but you do need a good financial literacy, the ability to read and understand the numbers of your business. And kind of coming at it that way, we're a simple approach. We're going to use common sense language. We'll try to provide some practical things that you can actually do, that you can implement. We don't talk debits and credits and whatnot. So people do come in and they'll say, I'm just going to take some of your courses. We'll see how it goes. And then they might then call and say, I took the courses. That worked great. However, I'd really like you to look at my stuff and tell me your feedback on I don't think my chart of accounts is set up right. Pretty sure my financials aren't quite showing me what we want. And furthermore, I think we're leaving money on the table somewhere because we're not quite making what I thought we would. So it's a lot of sort of diagnostic work as well. But folks can get themselves probably 80% of the way there with sort of the online information and the network of folks to talk to.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's go back to, how did you find craft beer, or how did craft beer find you?
Well, I started my journey, like sort of in the professional world, was my dad had his own business, and I was like, well, I'm going to go work for my dad. The name was, my last name is Shumway, and the business was Shumway and Sons, and I was the son, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to be in Dad's business. And he was a tree guy. He'd climb trees and cut limbs and haul brush and throw it in a chipper. I'm like, well, that sounds kind of fun. So I went off to college, and I was like, my role would be understand business so you can come back and work with Dad and you'll take over the business eventually. And so I went into college, and I came home in the summer, and I'd work for Dad. And I'm like, this sucks. I don't want to do this. You're outside, there's bugs everywhere. I'm getting cut and scratched, and they wouldn't let me use the chainsaw because that was for the other guys. So really all I was doing was hauling brush all day. And I was like, yeah, I don't know about this. So I just had that hard conversation with Dad, but I continued on the business and accounting path, graduated, and then realized, well, I kind of like this. Let me do the CPA thing. So I went for a certified public account. Worked for a CPA firm, had a number of clients, one of which was a beer wholesaler. And I was like, wow, how amazing would that be if I could combine my love of beer and numbers? And so sure enough, they had a CFO at the time, going back quite a ways, who was retiring after having been their CFO for 47 years at this local beer wholesaler. So I'm like, what are the odds of this? And they reached out to me via one of the partners. And we really connected, and they were, at the time we were all about the same age, still are. And so I transitioned over to be the CFO for this beer wholesaler, and did that for, a decade and a half until we sold off all of those entities. And then what do we do now? Well, became a partner and CFO at a brewery. I'm like, wow, this is really cool too, because you're playing in the same sandbox, as we know, distributor, brewery, but they're doing very different things. And so while a distributor can be interesting, very logistics driven, very sales driven, it's warehouses and trucks and bricks, and it's very capital intensive, as we know. And a brewery is too, but now you're making stuff. You're like, wow, the brewers would come up, hey, you got to try this. I'm like, well, yeah, I will try that. And so you can have a lot. I feel like there's a lot more room for creativity, for innovation, the flexibility. Whereas as a distributor, for good or bad, you're kind of tied to who your big brand is. If it's Anheuser-Busch, it's Miller Coors. They're sort of dictating what your sales and marketing plan is going to be, what your portfolio is going to be by and large. Yes, there are obviously craft beers and whatnot, and non-alcoholic products and so forth. But I felt there was a lot more flexibility, but just a whole different dynamic. So really kind of seeing, two of the three tiers of the three-tier system kind of back to back like that. I think so, it sort of helped me because I could sort of see both sides, because as a beer wholesaler, you're working with a lot of craft breweries and you're doing contracts and this and that, and you're trying to be a good business partner, although there's always bad stories about what's going on out there. And then you get on the other side of it as a brewery, and you can really understand, okay, so here's what your beer wholesaler is thinking, so this is really how you can kind of make a better partnership. So I think it helped me. I tend to be, I think, kind of open-minded and, trying to see, what everybody's perspective is and how we can kind of work together. Because ultimately, that's what we do. I mean, we're partners out there. So I think having that was a little bit of a unique, providing me with a little bit of a unique perspective from, hey, I'm a CPA, I understand the numbers conceptually, whatever your business model is, go from a beer wholesaler to a brewery. And then, just do it for 25 years. And you're like, oh yeah, I think in trial and error, you kind of figure some things out that hopefully can be useful for folks.
No doubt. What's the coolest project you've ever worked on related to the brewing industry? You've certainly seen many.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, honestly, and this is sort of a dodge to your question, but it's like coolest people, working with really cool people. So it's, it's when you sort of are consulting, right? It's a lot of it is dependent on who are you consulting with and for, and is it collaborative, and, are we vibing, are they picking up when I'm putting down, and vice versa. So I would say by and large, I'm very lucky, a lot of really cool people and a lot of really cool projects. I will pick out one in particular, startup brewery. This gentleman approached me, and, we've really just become really good friends. So over the course of the engagement, he's a firefighter, first responder. I'm like, oh, I like this guy already. And, just a really, really cool guy. And so we went through the process of building his plan and ultimately kind of getting to watch from a distance as he built his brewery and he put it together. And he ended up, as part of our work together, starting his own kind of podcast, if you will, about how his journey was in starting his own brewery and a lot of the twists and turns. So that he could then help kind of pay it forward and help other people and say, look, these are the things that I kind of learned the hard way, and really granular stuff. I focus, by and large on the financial aspects, but he got super granular in his podcast. So number one, really cool project. I love the theme of it, very fire engine, firefighter themed brewery, first responder, all that stuff, and just a really, really good person. And then just to kind of take our work together, and then he put his spin on it and put it back out in the world. I thought was really cool.
That is cool. You didn't mention your podcast. Are you still doing that?
Got to do the podcast, the Craft Brewery Financial Training Podcast.
Right. All right.
Got to check it out. It's one of my favorite things to do. And I think I've heard this a lot with people who are like, you fall, into a pod. You're like, oh, I guess people are doing a podcast. I'll do a podcast. And I'm like, man, I love this. You get to meet so many cool people. And, learn a lot of things. And I heard this in the past where other people that were doing podcasts were like, a lot of times it's like you're scratching your own itch. It's like, man, I'd love to learn about this. Who knows about this? And you're like, oh, Julie Rhodes knows about this. She's a marketing expert. I want to get Julie on my podcast. And then you get, then Julie and I have become friends over the years. And then there's so much that we can share. And then there's this guy, what's his name again? Oh, Andrew Copeland. Reach out to Andrew. What's Andrew know? Oh, Secret Hopper. Tell me more about that. So you can kind of like dig in on all this stuff. It's like we all have sort of these specialties, right? Like I know about this, micro fraction of a 1% of everything. And so there's all these other people, you can add them together. And then you had mentioned this before, I think we started recording, Laura, it was, this stuff can kind of live on forever. So you do a podcast, you invest that hour or so, you learn something and you put it out in the world and it's there forever. These things can be downloaded and shared and re-listened to. And I think it's a very flexible medium too, that people can be, you could be running on the treadmill or cooking dinner or driving, on a road trip somewhere and you're listening to podcasts like that. So it's a very easy way, I think, to consume information. And I've had a lot of great feedback, like, yeah, I heard about you through the podcast, or I learned this through the podcast. And like, probably more than anything I've done, that's been the best feedback. So
I've really enjoyed the podcasts as well. And these, I like these too.
Yeah.
Can you pick out a complex or problematic situation that you've worked on that kind of sticks out for you?
I think the hardest ones, because so when we think about like the brewing industry, it's we brew beer, but we're not like unique in the sense that these are manufacturing companies. So we manufacture beer, but there's other manufacturers that manufacture, everything. I used to work for a company that manufactured police batons. It's very complicated. They're making, extruded materials and, extended batons with steel. And there's lots of pieces, parts, and assembly and, machinery and all that. And so I've seen like really complex, complicated manufacturing companies. And then you come over to beer and you're like, well, it's not that, right? There's hops and grains and water and yeast and whatnot that goes in, and it goes from here to here to here. However, the cost side of it can be really complicated. So, I would say from a complex or problematic standpoint, it's almost always how do I measure the cost of my beer, right? How do I capture the costs? How do I allocate it? And then once I kind of know that, how do I assign like pricing and margin? How do I know what my margins are? And so every client I work with, and what that does is it then extends to inventory, because we talk about inventory valuation. So how you cost is effectively how you're going to be, doing your inventory carrying value, and how you capture these things and how you put them on the balance sheet ultimately is going to inform really your whole financial situation. So we have, the most expensive item on our P&L is cost of goods sold. It just is. So really the complexity around that. So that's one of the things that I do in the courses, or I'll work with people on, is, let's kind of back up and talk about what it is from a macro level. What does your beer cost to make? So we just say like, it's everything involved in the production and packaging of your beer, full stop. Kind of let that sink in. Okay, everything? Yeah, everything. So, and then we say you've got your direct materials. We can get our hands around that. We got hops and grains. We got cardboard and cans, bottles, caps, labels, you name it. All the things we can touch and feel direct material. We got direct labor, your brewer, your cellar person, your packaging person. What about the benefits? Yep, the benefits. Everything involved in the production and packaging. And then you have this tricky little thing called overhead, which is everything else that's involved in the production and packaging. So that's your utilities, it's your insurance, it's a portion of your lease, etc. So we say it's a complex problem, but let's start kind of with a simple definition of it. Everything involved in the production and packaging of your beer. And then we'll break it down into direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. And then we get to the tricky work of actually measuring those things and assigning it to all of your different products. That's where things kind of get like, well, how would we ever do that? So other businesses do it all the time. So we can do it. And then it's just like, how do we do it in a systematic way so that we're capturing the cost consistently and accurately? And then we can actually do something with it. So we try to kind of walk through that, but it is complex. There's no question about it, because we've got work in process. So what is that? It's before it actually gets packaged and it's finished goods. And after it's a raw material. Well, it's this in between stage. So we have to measure that as well. So first, it's concept to take this complex problem and kind of make it more tangible and approachable. And then it's process in terms of how do we do something with that concept? How do we that's great information. It's everything involved in the production and packaging, but how do I actually measure that? So that's where software systems can come in. We kind of walk through the process and kind of go through it, but that's almost without question. I mean, there are some breweries that are like, no, we understand that, but I would say 9 out of 10 that I work with don't have a good grasp on it. So it's really just kind of walking through and breaking that problem down into smaller parts.
Yeah, yes, much respect for that. So how does that connect, or let it lead us into this discussion about cash flow projections and management? What are your tips? What would you like to share today?
Yeah, cash flow is a thing. It's really an exciting thing. And we did Nashville at Craft Brewers Conference. I did do a presentation on cash flow. And I'll tell you, can I tell you my joke really quick?
Sure.
So I get up there and the room is full. I mean, the room is full. I'm going to probably exaggerate and say there were probably like 500 people in this room. And So my joke was, I stood up, I said, wow, there's a lot of people here to learn about cash flow. This must be important. I said, I did this talk about 10 years ago, and there were two people in the room. One was my mom and one was my best friend. And my best friend got up and left halfway through because he's like, I just can't take this anymore. And my mom stuck it out. And so I looked out in the crowd and I said, told him that story. And I said, would you mind, would you say hi to my mom? Like if I count 3, 2, 1, would you say hi, mom? And so I took this little video and they all went, hi, mom. And it was, probably the best moment of my life when that happened.
Did you share with your mom?
Yeah, I sent her the video and I said, Ma, check this out. And she goes, I can't hear it. I don't know what they're saying. I'm like, okay, never mind. So she was not impressed. I'm like, well, I did this for you. So yeah, cash flow. I mean, obviously that's sort of a goofy little joke, but 10 years ago, and I remember back in the day, the OGs for finance, like Audra Gajunas, Maria Pierman, Chris Farman, these, we would be playing to empty rooms. I mean, you'd get up there and you'd talk about cash flow, you'd talk about budgeting. The people were not coming out, and so they're coming out now, in large part because we're sort of realizing, wow, it's a brewery business. We've been focusing on the brewery side. Now we have to focus on the business side because they really are one and the same. So learning about cash flow, and part of the presentation that I gave was, the tip number one is you really just need to kind of understand what cash flow is, right? It sounds obvious. Yeah, I know what that is. It's cash. But so it's cash that's flowing into and out of your business. And then how are we sort of capturing that? How are we measuring that? And ultimately, how are we managing it? Because most businesses in our space really don't have a cash management plan. So we start by kind of defining what cash flow is and what it isn't. And then we sort of talk about the importance of having a management plan to really actively just keep an eye on it. And then we just share simple tools and models that you can use to do that. So one of the challenges with regular financial accounting is confusing. So we use these words. I think a lot of professions do it. I know Candace dropped off, but she would probably agree with me in terms of, so whatever your profession is, a legal profession, any profession, we use acronyms, we use terms probably as shorthand, but it's also a little bit of exclusionary, like, oh, he's using some fancy words. So there's no shortage of fancy words in financial accounting either. So we try to move off of those and talk in plain terms. One of the fancy words in financial accounting is accrual accounting, because that's sort of your traditional GAAP-based. GAAP is generally accepted accounting principles. I don't use that word a lot. But accrual accounting basically means we're recording transactions. So the first thing we need to differentiate is that when you look at the profit on your income statement, it's not the same as cash. It's not the same as cash flow. So if you've got a $10,000 profit, it doesn't mean you got $10,000 worth of cash. The opposite could be true, because what's happening is that income statement, that P&L, is saying, well, I've got sales. Well, you've got sales, but you may not have actually collected the money. So if you're self-distributing or you're selling to a wholesaler, the sale that you record today, you might not get that money for 30 days, or in the case of self-distribution, ever. But the income statement says you've got a sale. Likewise, your expense, we're recording that really as we incur the expense and we have an obligation to pay it, not when we've actually paid it. So this is accruing, this is recording. We're talking about transaction, a sale when it's earned, an expense when it's incurred, and we have an obligation to pay it. So that invoice comes in, I owe a vendor some money. I need to record that. I record an expense and I record an obligation to pay it. So it's an expense and accounts payable. There's no cash involved there. So when I look at that income statement and I see a net profit, well, good, we have a profit. But what is happening to the cash? So that's where the cash flow statement comes in. But another limitation on financial accounting and reporting is the cash flow statement, frankly, sucks. What do I do with this thing? I can run a cash flow statement, but I'm like, what is this telling? I don't know what it's telling me. It's showing me all these accounts, and this went up and that went down and the other went sideways. I don't know what to do. So we sort of take that and say, let's put that over here for now. Let's put that traditional cash flow statement over here, and let's talk about some practical and approachable ways to really measure that cash flow. So a couple of the tools that I shared, I'd be happy to, share with anyone watching now or later, is some just simple templates that you can use to kind of track your cash flow. We tend to start with just like this 8-week cash flow tracker. And essentially what it's saying is, what do I have for cash right now? And we term this like money in and money out. So I have money, and then I've got money that's coming in. So I have taproom receipts. I've got maybe receipts from self-distribution or wholesale. Maybe I've got some miscellaneous sale of equipment, or maybe I'm selling some hot. So I've got some other money coming in. So I've got money in. So that's cash plus that money that's expected to come in, and then I got money out. So then we kind of break it down and we say, well, what are the components of money out? I have accounts payable that I'm paying. I've got payroll. I've got a rent check that's coming due. I may have some other one-off things that I want to put on there, and you're really just sort of projecting a short period of time, what I started with, what money's coming in, what's going out, and what I'm going to end with. And I do this on a weekly basis, so it makes it like, oh yeah, well, I know what my payroll was this week, so I'm going to write that number in or put it on the spreadsheet. I know what my rent is because that's pretty consistent. I mean, it's the same every month, and I'm going to put that in. And so then you can really just kind of break it down and say, what is cash flow? We're going to forecast these things on this sheet on a fairly short time frame. So this week, and then what do we think it's next week is going to be? So we're going to forecast that based on, what we think we're going to have for accounts payable, when we think our next payroll is going to, when we know when our next payroll is going to run, and so forth. And we do that over that 8-week period. So then you can kind of get your hands around a more practical look at a cash flow statement. It's not perfect, but it's a good kind of starting point to build a cash flow management plan. So there's a number of other components, but I'll stop there and see if I'm hitting the mark in terms of some tips on cash flow.
I'd say you're hitting it square on. Anybody have any questions at this point?
I have a question. So, Kary, are you, in addition to like the one-off consulting, are you doing fractional CFO services for breweries as well?
Yeah, I mean, I like that word. I haven't really used that word a lot, but if that's what people, yeah, it's essentially that. So I'll do so if I work with people in a one-on-one type basis, it's typically project-based, because I want to make sure, like, am I delivering value? Is this what you want? And then if they like it, at the conclusion of that, I say, well, if you want to continue to work together, we can do this fractional CFO type model, whereby, and my recommendation is, we typically do a mid-month meeting and then a month-end meeting so that we can check in and we can see how are you doing relative to your financial goals and expectations. So we have to start with, what are your financial goals and expectations, and we put it in a plan, and then so we can actually see it, because a lot of times we're like, it's really not well defined. So we got to have a budget, got to have one.
Make beer, sell beer.
Make beer, sell beer. That's right. That's good. I like that. But I would say, make beer, sell beer, make money, put money in the bank. So yeah, we will do that.
You're more counseling though than you are actually doing the work.
That's right. So I don't do any, inputs and outputs and whatnot. What I'll do is I'll say, all right, would recommend, first we start kind of at that fundamental level, like, all right, who is actually paying your bills? Who is running payroll? Who's doing your receipts? Who's sort of in charge of your general ledger and your financials? Like, who's doing that? Because very often it's, the same person that's brewing the beer, that's, running the van down to they're also doing the books, or maybe their spouse is doing it, or mother-in-law, or, okay, we do outsource that, but it's sort of this sort of afterthought, if you will. So we kind of start with, well, we need, all the financial reporting in the world's, the best financial report isn't going to mean anything unless we have good numbers to start with, and that really is the blocking and tackling. So you got to, pay stuff. You got to have good systems to record all of that information, so that when we run those reports, we're actually looking at good quality information. So that's kind of where we start, is who does your books? What's your level of comfort with, kind of the timeliness, completeness, and accuracy. Those are the sort of the three legs of the stool. So if they're really not comfortable with it, yeah, I will say, look, I would recommend these people that maybe go talk to them and see it. They specialize in breweries. They're really good at this stuff. They can kind of get you set up and running, and then I can come in afterwards and say, all right, good. Your numbers are now in good shape. Let's run some reports. Let's set up some trackers. and let's get you using this information so you can make better decisions in your business. And so once we have that in place, then we return the focus to things like, all right, what's the standard book of reports that you're running? What are you looking for? I can do the analysis and kind of point to them really quickly, like, well, this, and this are out of whack. You don't need to look at this whole 5-page report. We need to focus on these 3 things. So it zeroes it down. And then I say, well, the most likely cause of this variance is this, or this. So why don't you chase that down? We're going to meet again, in 2 weeks, and hit me via email or call me if you find anything. So we're trying to sort of problem solve in real time, and then identify where they are at sort of relative to those financial goals once we set them.
And then I assume you have a standard set of KPIs you're recommending then for the. Are there any KPIs that you think are unique to the space we're in that would be different from something you would see in a just as kind of a standard kind of manufacturing type business?
I think it's probably terminology, probably language that makes it different, because we'll measure things in barrels, right? We'll say labor per barrels, dollar per barrels, revenue per, so it's the reference point that tends to be unique. I think the KPIs themselves probably are very similar across, like a manufacturing type environment. But we'll sort of reframe it so that it's like, oh yeah, that's clear that that's a beer or brewery KPI. So yeah, we'll look at, like, we start with, and Andrew and I talk KPIs all the time, so he's probably like, oh man, KPIs again. Just love KPIs. So we'll talk about the first step with any KPIs is like, measuring what's actually going to make a difference in your business. Because people will say, what KPI should I measure? I'm like, well, it really depends on, are you trying to solve a problem? And just like, I was Kary's roommate at CBC, and I forget, I missed the rest of it. Anyway, yes. So we start with what can we measure that when we hit the goal, it's going to make a material difference or outcome for our business. And that could be a financial outcome. It could be cash flow, profitability. It could be, sales growth, whatnot. But really measuring stuff that matters is kind of what it comes down to. So I have a standard set where I could say, okay, we're going to do the off-the-shelf taproom metrics. Here's your scorecard. Measure these 5 things. You're gonna kind of cover the baseline. But I really kind of try to start with, what are you challenged with right now? What's working, what's not working well? What's a problem you're trying to solve, a challenge you're trying to overcome? And once you identify it, we're like, all right, can we quantify that? If we were to quantify the problem as it exists right now, and then we were to quantify what does success look like in the future, and maybe a simple example, if we go back to cash flow, would be, if we're measuring inventory days on hand, because that's a big one. Everybody's got inventory. And so we'd say, well, a KPI you really should look at is your inventory days on hand. You could also call it inventory turnover. So you'd say, you feel like, often people say, I feel like we're just carrying too much inventory. I go out there, we have tons of inventory, this, that, and the other. So you say, well, what are your inventory days on hand? And we start with, what does that even mean? So this might be a KPI that solves a specific problem. And that KPI is intended to answer the question, do I have the right amount of inventory? Do I have too much? Do I have too little? So you identify days on hand is, I have X amount of inventory on hand right now to satisfy a future market demand. So I need to look at my sales forecast. What does my sales forecast say over the next 30 days? How much inventory do I plan on selling? And how does that compare to what I have right now? And you just do a little math and you say, oh, actually, you're sitting on 42 days worth of inventory. Is that the right number? You're like, wow, I don't know if that's the right number. And then you say, well, you got to compare it to a goal. And the goal might be, well, I can brew and package beer in 20 days. So I really don't need more than 25 days worth of finished goods days on hand and for my inventory, but I've got 42. Yeah, so you're running a little high. You're carrying 42, you only need 25. Just one example. You can do that for, your raw materials, packaging goods and whatnot. Finished goods is the easiest because you're forward forecasting what you're going to sell and you're comparing it to what you have. So just to kind of bundle that up, I'd say with KPIs, you start with what's a problem that you're trying to solve, or maybe an opportunity you're trying to take advantage of. See if you can quantify it, make sure it's going to be making a material difference when you hit that number, and then start measuring it and then sharing it really with the people that can make a difference in your organization. Inventory days on hand, a lot of these things we say, it takes a village to raise a child. and it takes a village to manage your inventory. So I say engage the villagers, and tell them kind of how this works. And they might cringe at first because the non-spreadsheet lovers and the non-ratio lovers are like, I don't want to do that. But I'm telling you, once you get the love for those spreadsheets, it never goes away.
So how do you factor in things like not really knowing if the ratio of sales for one product versus another is going to be consistent? Do you kind of round up on all of that to make sure your inventory is taking that into account?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you start with, because it's interesting, like, so when I first started talking about like inventory days on hand, the first thing is I don't really know what that is, and I don't really know how to measure it. So we start like really macro. We say, let's just take your finished goods as a whole, and let's talk about kind of the concept of what we're trying to get to. And then once that's solidified, yeah, I get it. I understand days on hand is this. You explained it. We have the spreadsheet and we've been using that. And what's the next step? Well, the next step is you get more granular, and then you can look at it as you suggested and say, well, if I take all my finished goods, that includes kegs and packages and stuff that sells fast and stuff that does, it's like this number that's sort of an amalgamation of what do I do with that? Like, well, what do you do with it is you go and you do a days on hand calculation for everything in your portfolio. So we can get down to the SKU level. Well, and it's the same concept. So we start with the macro concept of all you're doing is comparing what you think you're going to sell to what you have on hand, and you're turning that into a number.
Right.
And then you do it on a SKU level, and you go through, if you got 100 SKUs, God bless you. Hopefully you got, less, but so maybe a couple dozen SKUs, 3 of which actually sell, and then do the math on that and then see what your days on hand look like. And then once you have that number, then you can really see, because your portfolio is going to be all over the place. So, one SKU is going to be, geez, we have 4 days on hand. That SKU we're actually out of right now. This SKU we have 190 days on hand, right? Because it doesn't sell. So this will start informing what your portfolio actually should look like too. Like, man, we're carrying a lot of inventory. I'll get off track real fast. You're probably going to have to stop me, Laura. But if you do like I love 80-20 analysis, right? So you do that, 80% of your results comes from 20% of your inputs. So if you run your portfolio and you say, what's actually selling and what percentage of the actual total sales, like how many SKUs actually make up 80% of my, it's remarkable, right? It's usually not even 80-20. It's usually like, 8% of your SKUs is 92% of your business. We used to do this all the time for beer wholesalers because we'd have thousands of SKUs. So anyway, it can help kind of not only say, how do I manage my cash flow? Well, one metric is days on hand because everybody's got inventory and probably a lot of it. And to use that scorecard for that purpose. But then it also kind of breaks down, geez, is my product mix right? I mean, I got salespeople trying to sell all these things when I really should just be focusing on, these 3 to 5 items, because these are actually what's selling. It's what seems to be what the consumer wants. And now I'm probably going more into the distribution and wholesale space. Your tap room, you get a little more room to run there.
But it's still informing your brewer too, right? You should be brewing more of or less of.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you kind of can get really these unintended benefits, I think, when you dig in on these things and you're like, oh, I was actually trying to measure inventory days on hand, but now I've discovered that I really need to kind of relook at my portfolio in terms of what we're focusing on for sales.
Well, we're at 9 minutes. So do you have some other key points you want to kick in there before we run out of time?
Yeah, I mean, I would say most folks that I work with don't have a financial plan, so that's the obvious, and it's really a very unsatisfying. So here's what I do is I hook people with the KPIs. Like I have KPI dashboards. We'll build those together. We'll customize it for you. And then we got to build a financial plan. So I think the tips would really be, the spoonful of sugar is we love KPIs. Let's do that. We'll talk KPIs.
And that means key performance indicators for those not grammatically.
Key performance indicators. There's a lot of terminology with open book management too. Great game of business. They use like a term called critical numbers, which I think is kind of cool. Key metrics. They all kind of mean the same thing, but critical numbers. It's critical. So I like that one too. I sort of use them interchangeably, but we can start with that because we think about those numbers as financial shorthand. It's really easy. Just the simplest number is sales growth as a percentage, right? Let's just measure it. Let's look at your different lines of business, maybe. So KPIs, 1, we can build that dashboard. 2, you got to have a financial plan, and it doesn't sound as fun, but once you dig into it, yeah, it's fun. It's fun. We can have some fun with those numbers, and And when I started the business originally, I know my business is Beer Business Finance, craftbreweryfinancialtraining.com. But the name of my legal entity is Numbers Are Friends. Numbers are friends. They're our friends. So we kind of have to approach it that way. Numbers in this context represent dollars. We all like dollars. So we're going to be building a financial plan. We're going to be talking about dollars. So those would be my words of wisdom. Start with the KPI dashboard, get yourself a financial plan, and then you've got a roadmap to take your brewery where you want it to get to.
Totally makes sense. Anybody have any other quick questions they want to feed in here? Julie, I'm sure you have something. Mandy?
Come on, Julie.
I know. I never get to. This is going to take way longer than 7 minutes.
Okay.
I have
Wendy
all
can
the
be
questions for
Mandy
Kary.
can
He
be
knows
shorter
that.
if you want.
I'm picking one. I don't know. Mendy, is yours quick? You can go first.
It could be. It could be. Just how important is it, or how critical is it to choose the right KPIs? There's lots of different indicators to choose from. So how critical is it in choosing the right ones?
Yeah, good question. I mean, super important, I think, because the line that I'll use is, we could measure almost anything because we have all this, and we often do. We measure everything, and then it's like, wow, what is actually meaningful here? So we walk through sort of the 3-question processes to figure out what's the most important KPI, what you should measure. I like to at least start with what's a problem you're trying to solve or a challenge you're trying to overcome. What's an opportunity you want to take advantage of, or what's the most gut check is what keeps you up at night, right? So you're lying in bed, you can't fall asleep, but what keeps you up at night? And I always joke because cash flow for me is what always keeps me up. So I need to have KPIs around cash flow. And we sort of, talked around this cash flow management plan and so forth. But yeah, it's super important to kind of get very clear and be very purposeful before you just start measuring things. Because before you know it, you're measuring things and we hit that number, and you're like, well, it didn't actually make a difference at all in what we wanted for an outcome.
And then I'll just add that we have a cash flow model that we use that is probably one of the key management tools that we use on a day-to-day basis.
That's awesome. It warms my heart.
That spreadsheet love, that's what it's all about.
Love right here.
I didn't mean to snort laugh that loud. I forgot I wasn't muted anymore.
It's immortalized now.
Great. It's recorded. Awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me go ahead and wrap up. Kary, thank you so much for sharing. I know that could be like a several hours worth of rabbit holes to go down. Very quickly. So thank you for being here. Just once again, thank you to Arrived for sponsoring us today. Super appreciate all of that support and helping to make these possible. Coming up soon, we have our June resource group coming up with Andy Mancine. We've got our next quarterly webinar in August about raising investment capital legally. And then we'll be at HomebrewCon from June 22nd to 24th, a little bit before, a little bit after. So you're welcome to join us there as well. This will be recorded and be hanging out in our YouTube world this evening. And that's what I've got. Thank you all for being here. Super appreciate it. It's kind of fun that everybody that's here was at CBC with us. Kind of a nice family reunion around Kary's stories.
Thank you, Laura.
All right.
Thanks, Laura.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Kary.
Thank you.